You look like a waitress in that dress." Mocking laughter rang out, turning the CEO's daughter into a joke in the middle of a billion-dollar dinner. But just minutes later, when the arrogant billionaire family bragged about their $750 million deal, the young woman quietly lifted her phone and ordered its cancellation. The entire hall froze, every eye locked on the girl they had mocked. And in seconds, their $750 million empire crumbled before them. Olivia stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her back to the towering windows that framed Manhattan's skyline. The city lights twinkled outside, a quiet contrast to the sharp glitter of the chandeliers above. Her dress was plain black, no designer label, no embellishments, just clean lines that hugged her frame modestly. Her dark hair fell in loose waves, untouched by a stylist's hands, and her face was bare, no makeup, no gloss, just her natural features, beautiful in a way that didn't demand attention. She was 24, raised in one of the wealthiest families in the country, but you'd never know it looking at her. Her father had taught her early on to carry herself with discipline, to let her actions speak louder than flash. "Never show off," he'd said. When she was a kid, his voice steady as he knotted his tie in their sprawling estate. "Your worth isn't in what you wear, it's in what you do." Tonight, though, in this room full of billionaires and their egos, her simplicity made her a target. The gala was a spectacle, a glittering stage where wealth and power played out in real time. Crystal glasses clinked, heels clicked on marble floors, and every laugh felt like a performance. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. Billionaires and their families mingled, their voices loud as they discussed deals, investments, and who was who in their world. Olivia had slipped in quietly, hoping to blend into the background, her small clutch tucked under her arm. She was here to observe, to see the $750 million investment deal her father had been working on for months with the Harringtons, a family known for their ruthlessness and their need to dominate every room. She'd overheard her father that morning, his voice low over coffee in their kitchen. "They're sharks, Olivia," he'd said, stirring his cup. "But their resources could change everything for us." She'd nodded, already bracing for the night ahead, knowing she'd be walking into a lion's den. She found a spot near the windows, the cool glass a small anchor against the heat of the crowd. Her hands were folded in front of her, her posture calm but alert. She wasn't here to make a scene or to prove anything. She just wanted to understand the players her father was dealing with and to see the deal through his eyes. But before she could settle into the moment, a voice cut through the hum of conversation. Trevor Harrington, the billionaire's son, strutted toward her, his tailored suit gleaming under the lights, his smirk sharp enough to cut. He was in his late 20s, all slick hair and entitlement, the kind of guy who thought charm was something you could buy. He stopped too close, his cologne overwhelming, and leaned in. "You look like a waitress in that dress," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Heads turned. A ripple of laughter spread, sharp and mean, like a blade slicing through the air. Olivia's fingers tightened on her clutch, but her face stayed steady, her eyes locking onto his without a flicker of doubt. She didn't say a word. Her gaze was enough to make him shift just for a second before he doubled down with a grin. A woman across the table, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, tilted her head and squinted at Olivia. She was Claire, a socialite known for her sharp tongue and sharper Instagram posts, always chasing clout. "Sweetheart, did you borrow that dress from your mom's closet?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake pity. The table burst into laughter again, some clapping like it was a show. Claire leaned back, sipping her champagne, her eyes never leaving Olivia, waiting for a crack in her composure. Olivia's lips parted just for a moment, as if she might speak, but instead, she adjusted her clutch, her fingers deliberate, and let her silence answer. The room's laughter felt louder, but Claire's smile twitched like she'd expected more of a fight. "Hey, if this story's hitting you, right now, take a second to grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to share these moments with you. Let's keep walking through these stories together." The laughter grew, a wave crashing over the tables. A woman in a glittering red gown, her lips painted to match, leaned forward from her seat. Marissa Harrington, Trevor's mother, was the kind of person who could smile while twisting the knife. Her eyes sparkled with malice as she spoke, her voice carrying across the room. "CEO's daughter? She looks more like a poor student," she said, drawing out the words for maximum effect. The table erupted, their laughter louder now, more confident, like they had found their entertainment for the night. A man in a tux, his cufflinks probably worth more than Olivia's entire outfit, shook his head and muttered, "Her father must be ashamed to bring her here." The word stung sharp and personal, but Olivia didn't flinch. She smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes, and took a slow sip of her water. The glass was cool in her hand, grounding her as the room spun its venom. A younger man, maybe a cousin of the Harringtons, leaned forward, his tie slightly crooked, his grin wide and careless. He was Derek, the kind of guy who followed the family's lead without questioning, always eager to pile on. "Hey, no offense," he said, holding up his hands like he was being friendly, "but you're standing by the window like you're waiting for a bus. You sure you're at the right event?" The table howled, some slapping the table, their drinks sloshing. Olivia's shoulders tensed just for a second before she turned slightly, her eyes catching the city lights outside. She didn't answer, but the way she tilted her head like she was studying Derek's face made his grin falter. The laughter continued, but a few guests exchanged glances, sensing something unspoken in her stillness. The table was a battlefield now, every glance a weapon, every whisper a shot. A young woman with perfect blonde curls, her dress a cascade of sequins that screamed money, leaned toward her friend and stage whispered, "Why is she even here? She doesn't belong." Her friend, a guy with a Rolex glinting on his wrist, chuckled and added, "Maybe she's lost. Someone should point her to the staff exit." The table roared again, glasses clinking as they toasted their own cruelty. Olivia set her glass down, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was placing a chess piece on a board. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her silence was a wall they couldn't climb, a quiet defiance that made their laughter sound hollow. A waiter paused near Olivia, his tray balanced carefully, his eyes flicking to her stained dress with a flicker of sympathy. He was young, maybe her age, his uniform crisp, but his hands calloused from long shifts. He offered her a fresh napkin, his voice low. "Ma'am, would you like another?" Olivia met his gaze, her expression softening just enough to acknowledge his kindness. She took the napkin, her fingers brushing his, and nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The moment was small, but it cut through the noise of the room, a reminder that not everyone was playing the Harringtons' game. The waiter moved on, but a few guests nearby noticed their laughter dying down as they watched Olivia fold the napkin neatly in her lap. Dinner began, and the mood shifted, if only for a moment. Waiters moved through the room, plates clattering softly as they served. Olivia picked up her fork, her hands steady, and listened as the conversation turned to the deal. The Harringtons were in their element now, throwing around numbers and projections like they owned the future. Trevor leaned back in his chair, his voice loud and smug. "This deal's going to redefine the industry," he said, glancing at his father, Richard Harrington, who nodded with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Richard was the patriarch, his gray hair slicked back, his suit tailored to perfection, his presence dominating the room. Olivia tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. She spoke up, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the noise. "The market's volatile right now. Your projections don't account for the tariffs hitting next quarter or the supply chain issues in Asia." The table went quiet just for a beat. An older businessman, his tie loosened and his face weathered from years in boardrooms, raised an eyebrow. "She's not wrong," he said almost to himself. "That's sharper than my advisor's take." A few others nodded, their expressions shifting from mockery to curiosity. A woman in a green dress leaned toward her husband, whispering, "She knows her stuff." The husband nodded, his eyes lingering on Olivia like he was seeing her for the first time. Trevor's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Lucky guess," he snapped, tossing his napkin onto the table. But the air had changed. The laughter faded, replaced by a cautious interest. People were looking at Olivia differently now, like they were trying to figure out what they'd missed. A man in a pinstripe suit, his hair thinning and his voice oily, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Olivia. He was Victor, a Harrington ally who made his fortune brokering deals and stepping on anyone in his way. "You talk a big game for someone who looks like they shop at thrift stores," he said, his tone mockingly curious. "Where'd you learn to sound so smart?" "Community college." The table snickered, a few, clapping like it was a clever jab. Olivia paused, her fork hovering over her plate, then set it down with a soft clink. She looked at Victor, her eyes steady, and asked, "Where'd you learn to judge people by their clothes?" The question was simple, delivered without venom, but it landed like a slap. Victor's face reddened, and the table's laughter stuttered, a few guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The moment didn't last. Trevor, maybe, sensing the shift, stood up, his movements theatrical. He grabbed his wine glass and sauntered toward Olivia, his steps slow like he was savoring the attention. Then with a flick of his wrist, he accidentally spilled red wine across her dress. The liquid splashed over the black fabric, soaking it through, dripping onto the floor. "Oops, sorry," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "At least now it matches your cheap outfit." The room exploded in laughter louder than before, the sound echoing off the marble walls. Marissa clapped her hands delighted and added, "If she were really a CEO's daughter, she'd be wearing designer brands." The table raised their glasses, toasting to their cruelty, their eyes gleaming with entertainment. A few guests looked away, their faces tight, like they knew this had crossed a line. A woman in a silver gown, her hair piled high, stood up to join the fray. She was Evelyn, a distant Harrington relative, who thrived on gossip and social climbing. She walked over to Olivia, her heels clicking loudly, and held up her phone, snapping a photo of the wine-stained dress. "This is going straight to my followers," she said, her voice gleeful. "They'll love seeing the CEO's daughter looking like a mess." The table cheered, some pulling out their own phones, the flashes lighting up the room. Olivia's hand paused on the napkin, her fingers curling slightly, but she didn't look at Evelyn. Instead, she reached for her glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with a deliberate clink. The room's energy shifted just a fraction, as a few guests hesitated, their phones lowering like they sensed something wasn't right. Olivia looked down at the stain, her fingers brushing the wet fabric. Her fists tightened for a moment, then relaxed. She stood, her movements slow and graceful, and faced Trevor. Her voice was soft but sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Do you truly believe appearance is everything?" The question hung in the air, simple but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Trevor opened his mouth, then closed it, his confidence cracking. A man at the table, his face flushed from wine, blurted out, "That's exactly her father's composure." A few guests shifted in their seats, their laughter fading into awkward coughs. Olivia didn't wait for a response. She picked up a napkin, dabbed at her dress, and sat back down, her eyes sharp as ice. A man in a corner booth, his suit wrinkled and his eyes darting, leaned forward, whispering to his table. He was Paul, a mid-level investor who clung to the Harringtons' coattails, always eager to prove his loyalty. "I bet she's just here to spy for her dad," he said, loud enough for Olivia to hear, probably taking notes to run back to him. The table chuckled a few, nodding like it made perfect sense. Olivia's hand paused on her clutch, her fingers tracing the edge. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Paul's, and asked, "What makes you think I need to take notes?" The question was calm, almost curious, but it carried a weight that made Paul shrink back, his laugh dying in his throat. The room's chatter dipped, a few guests exchanging glances like they were starting to wonder who she really was. The Harringtons weren't done. Richard leaned forward, his voice booming with authority, his eyes locked on Olivia. "Your father is about to sign a $750 million deal with us," he said, his tone heavy with condescension. "You're nothing here," Marissa chimed in, her smile venomous. "If you're smart, you'll sit quietly and keep your mouth shut." The table erupted again, treating Olivia like a prop in their show. A few guests shook their heads, their expressions darkening like they knew this had gone too far. A woman in a blue dress muttered to her companion, "This is getting ugly." Olivia didn't move. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady, and started typing. A young woman at a nearby table, her necklace sparkling under the lights, leaned forward, her voice loud and teasing. She was Lila, a fashion influencer who lived for attention, her every move calculated for likes. "Girl, you should have at least borrowed some jewelry," she said, holding up her own diamond bracelet. "This is a gala, not a book club." The table laughed, some mimicking her gesture, flashing their own accessories. Olivia's eyes flicked to Lila's bracelet, then back to her face. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but clear. "Does that bracelet make you feel important?" The question was so direct, so devoid of malice, that Lila froze, her hand dropping to her lap. The laughter at her table stuttered, and a few guests turned away, their faces tight with secondhand embarrassment. The room didn't notice at first. They were too busy laughing, too caught up in their own power. But then Olivia held the phone to her ear, her voice low but clear. "Dad, I want this deal canceled. Right now." The words landed like a bomb. The laughter stopped. Glasses froze midair. Richard's face went slack, his fork clattering onto his plate. "Who do you think you are, to interfere?" He snapped, standing so fast his chair scraped the floor. But then her father's voice came through the phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If my daughter says so, the deal is off." The hall went silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy and suffocating. A man in a navy suit, his glasses perched on his nose, stood up, his voice trembling with indignation. He was George, a Harrington business partner who prided himself on his connections. "This is outrageous," he shouted, pointing at Olivia. "You can't just waltz in here and ruin a deal like that." The room buzzed, some nodding in agreement, others whispering in shock. Olivia didn't look at him. She slipped her phone back into her clutch, her movements calm, and folded her hands in her lap. The lawyer who had just entered the room paused, glancing at her, then continued toward her with the folder. George's face reddened, his voice rising, but Olivia's silence was louder, a quiet power that made his outburst seem small. Olivia set the phone down, her expression unchanged. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The Harringtons were unraveling. Trevor's hands shook as he reached for his glass, spilling more wine. Marissa's smile vanished, her face pale as she clutched her necklace, her fingers trembling. Richard stammered, "Mr. CEO, please let us explain." But the line was already dead. Guests started whispering their voices, a low buzz that filled the room. A woman in a gold dress pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Another man leaned toward his wife, muttering, "Did she just—" Olivia sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes scanning the room like she was taking it all in. A man in a dark suit entered the ballroom, his steps quick and purposeful. He was a lawyer, his briefcase clutched tightly, his face grim. He walked straight to Olivia and handed her a folder. She opened it, glanced at the papers and nodded. Then she stood, her voice steady but firm. "Here's the evidence," she said, holding up the documents. "The contract was voided in the system 10 minutes ago. You won't see a single cent from this deal." The crowd gasped, some pulling out their phones to record, others leaning forward to catch every word. The Harringtons collapsed into their seats, their faces drained of color. Trevor stared at the floor, his hands gripping the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. A woman in a corner, her shawl slipping off her shoulders, stood up, her voice shaking with desperation. She was Diane, a Harrington family friend who'd staked her reputation on their success. "You're making a mistake," she said, her eyes wide as she pointed at Olivia. "You're throwing away years of planning." The room turned to watch the tension thick. Olivia closed the folder, her fingers steady, and looked at Diane. "The mistake was yours," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You assumed I was nobody." Diane's mouth opened, then closed, her shawl falling to the floor as she sank back into her chair. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others filming the exchange, the weight of Olivia's words settling over the room. The room was chaos now. One of the Harringtons, a cousin with a loud voice and a bad tie, screamed, "You've destroyed our family's future." Marissa gasped, her voice trembling. "You don't understand the consequences." But Olivia didn't flinch. She closed the folder, her movements precise, and handed it back to the lawyer. Guests were on their feet now, some shaking their heads, others whispering furiously. A woman in a gold dress muttered, "I knew something was off about her." A man nearby nodded, "She's not just some nobody." The air was thick with shock, with realization, with the weight of what had just happened. A man at the edge of the room, his suit slightly too big, clutched his phone, his face pale. He was Mark, a junior executive who had been riding the Harringtons' wave for years. He stepped forward, his voice shaky but loud. "You can't do this," he said, his eyes darting between Olivia and the crowd. "You're just a kid playing with power you don't understand." The room hushed, waiting for her response. Olivia turned to him, her eyes steady, and said, "I understand power better than you ever will." The words were quiet, but they hit like a thunderclap. Mark stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hand, the screen cracking as it hit the floor. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some shaking their heads, others filming the moment. Olivia's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression softening for the first time all night. She slipped it back into her clutch and turned toward the door. The crowd parted as she walked to her steps, slow but steady, her stained dress somehow looking regal now. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The Harringtons sat frozen, their empire crumbling in real time. Phones around the room lit up with notifications, bank alerts, emails, panicked messages. The family's accounts were frozen, their assets locked, their deal dead in the water. Trevor's face was ashen, his eyes fixed on the table. Marissa clutched her husband's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. A woman in a velvet dress, her hands trembling, stood up, her voice breaking as she spoke. She was Sophia, a Harrington ally who had built her career on their name. "You're ruining everything," she cried, tears smearing her mascara. "Do you know what this means for us?" The room turned to Olivia, waiting for her reaction. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and turned back just enough to meet Sophia's eyes. "I know exactly what it means," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle. The words landed like a final blow, and Sophia sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. The crowd's whispers grew frantic, phones flashing as they captured the moment. A man stepped into the room, and everything changed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding without a single word. Olivia's husband. He didn't need an introduction. The way the room shifted said it all. Guests straightened up, their whispers dying out. Richard tried to stand, his voice shaky. "We can fix this," he said, but it sounded desperate, like a plea. Trevor looked away, his hands trembling. Marissa's eyes darted to the floor, her confidence gone. Olivia's husband didn't speak. He just walked to her side, his hand brushing hers lightly. She looked up at him, and for a moment her face softened, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. The fallout was swift. The next morning, headlines screamed across every major outlet. A single call from the CEO's daughter destroyed a $750 million empire in seconds. Social media was relentless. A video of Trevor spilling the wine went viral, shared thousands of times, with captions calling him out. He was dropped from his family's company board within hours. Marissa's charity foundation, built on her public image, lost its biggest sponsors by noon. Richard spent weeks in meetings trying to salvage what was left, but the numbers didn't lie. Their empire was gone, dismantled by a single call. Evelyn's photo of Olivia's stained dress backfired, the comments tearing her apart for her cruelty. She deleted her account by the end of the day. Olivia didn't stay to watch it unfold. She left the gala with her husband, her steps steady, her head high. The next day, she was back at her father's office, sitting in a meeting, her plain dress replaced with another simple outfit. Nobody mentioned the night before. They didn't need to. The way people looked at her now, cautious, respectful, said enough. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence carried weight, her presence enough to shift the room. A junior assistant dropped a file on her desk, her hands shaking slightly, and whispered, "I saw the news. You were incredible." Olivia nodded, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softened for a moment before she turned back to her work. Years ago, she'd stood in a different room, a smaller one, with her father. He'd been signing papers, his pen moving quickly across the page. She was 16, her hair tied back, her sneakers scuffed from running around the estate. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," he'd said, not looking up from his work. "Just be you. That's enough." She'd nodded, her hands in her pockets, and carried those words with her ever since. That memory flickered in her eyes sometimes, like when she saw a car like the one her father used to drive, or when she heard someone laugh the way he did. Once at a stoplight, she'd paused, her hand on the wheel, watching a black sedan pull away, its taillights glowing like the ones she had chased as a kid. The Harringtons' downfall didn't end with the gala. Trevor's face was everywhere, his smirk replaced with a look of defeat. He tried to post an apology online, but the comments tore him apart. Marissa's social circle shrank, her invitations to galas drying up. She was seen at a coffee shop a week later alone, her designer bag looking out of place as she stared at her phone. Richard's company lost contracts, investors pulling out one by one. Claire's Instagram posts about the gala were deleted, her followers dropping as the backlash grew. Derek, the cousin with the crooked tie, was quietly let go from his job, his name erased from the family's website. The family's name, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a cautionary tale. Olivia kept moving forward. She didn't read the headlines, didn't check the trending hashtags. She was too busy working, sitting in on meetings, reviewing contracts, her voice steady as she spoke. Her father trusted her, always had. She'd grown up watching him navigate rooms like the one at the gala, watching him stay calm when others lost their nerve. She'd learned from him not just how to talk business, but how to carry herself when the world tried to tear her down. At a board meeting a week later, an executive hesitated before addressing her, his voice careful. "Ms. Olivia, your input on the new strategy?" She nodded, her pen tapping lightly on the table, and gave her thoughts, her words precise and unshakable. "You've felt it, haven't you? That moment when someone looks at you and decides you're less. When they laugh, thinking they've got you figured out. But you know who you are. You know your worth. You're not alone in that. Olivia's story isn't just hers, it's yours too. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.